I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast.
Most debates about crime policy are framed as a choice. You're either tough on crime or you're not. You focus on enforcement or you focus on prevention. And the answers tend to sound simple. But once you move from talking about crime to actually trying to reduce it, things get more complicated, requiring nuanced solutions to complex problems. My guest today is Neera Tanden, President and CEO of the Center for American Progress and a longtime policy advisor who has worked across multiple administrations, including serving as domestic policy advisor in the Biden White House. In this episode, we talk about what crime policy looks like from inside that system, what we've learned from the last few years, and why approaches focused on accountability and prevention don't have to be in conflict. We also get into the gap between what's politically compelling and what's actually effective, and why solving this problem is harder than the debate makes it sound. Let's get started. My guest today is Neera Tanden. Neera, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
So first question to every guest, what is your background? What brought you here today? And then I'm going to add an addendum to that I don't normally get to ask every guest is, what is it like working at the White House? So I'm very curious to hear this answer.
I'll take this in order. I'm currently the CEO and president of the Center for American Progress, which is a multi-issue think tank in Washington. It's we're kind of on the center left, but our goal is really to try to solve problems. Develop ideas to solve problems. We have policy teams and national security, economic policy, domestic policy, and we have a crime and criminal justice team. And it's that team that really has authored our work on crime. Before that, I was domestic policy advisor to President Biden. I was also staff secretary, which before that role, which is in charge of information flow in the White House, is a really interesting job. But the Domestic Policy Council job is one in which you are overseeing domestic policy for the President of the United States, and it was a really amazing job and a great privilege. Before that, I'd worked at CAP for about a decade. I was also its CEO and president before then. I helped start CAP way back in 2000, and I've served in 3 White Houses. I served on the Domestic Policy Council way back in the second term of the Clinton White House. Was a lot younger then. Do you want to note that? And then I worked on healthcare reform for President Obama. So I have a lot of policy experience. And in the late 90s, when I worked for President Clinton, I did a lot of work I was on the Children and Families team and the Domestic Policy Council, and we did a lot of work on school violence and collaborated with the crime team back then on kids and access to guns. I've worked, as I said, in the White House, but I've also worked on a variety of presidential campaigns. Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Barack Obama's presidential campaign. I've worked on crime issues in all of those areas.
So I have a very boring CAP story, which is in 2006 when I was in grad school at GW, I interned with a group called the National Security Networks that sort of had one office in CAP. And so I went to CAP's office frequently for a couple of months back then. And then I got a job with the intelligence community and was off. But
yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, we're the same building. Now we have the bottom 4 floors instead of being spread out. So it's much better.
That sounds nice. So where do you see CAP fitting in on sort of the criminal justice policymaking process?
I think we're really trying to offer ideas of how to, improve public safety, lower crime in the United States. And I think this is a debate that's become, like many debates, highly politicized. And our goal is to offer kind of evidence-based solutions. Crime is an interesting issue because even when it comes down, it's still a bad thing. So, it's not like, people, if you're a victim of crime, even if there's less crime in the neighborhood, you're still a victim. So it is something that you really want to drive down as far as you possibly can from a policy perspective. So, I think sometimes in some circles, you'll have a lot of discourse of crime is coming down. Why do we need to do anything? And I think this is a real mistake for those of us who believe in a government that works for people and strong government. We have to deliver results. And what's really interesting is that I think we've learned a lot about what works over the last several years. We've had real deep declines in crime. I welcome, your views on why that has happened. But we have seen a lot of policy variation and innovation at the local level. And what we try to do in our work is look at what's working around the country and then create a guide, essentially a policy guide of best practices where, at the national level, we could drive down crime even more if we kind of got out of our partisan corners and thought about how to actually solve this problem even better than we are right now.
So I want to dig deeper on that. You guys have put out a lot of reports and things like that. Is there without, this taking several hours to summarize all of the reports, is there a general guidelines, general thoughts, general direction that you see that CAP sees as far as like how policymakers should approach things in a realistic direction?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost, and this is again all based on evidence, we understand or we believe that the best way to reduce crime is for people, would be criminals, to believe that they will be punished if they commit crime. And I think this is a really important issue because in the 90s, and you still see this in the debates, there's a lot of discussion about the length of sentencing. So if you just expand the length of sentencing for crimes, people will argue they're reducing crime. But that's not actually what the evidence dictates. The evidence shows that, people don't think about the future so much. It's much more about the certainty of punishment for lawbreakers. And so, and we learned a lot during COVID, which is that there is some research, and I really would do welcome your views on this, but there's some research that indicates that one of the reasons why we had a spike was because the system of justice kind of slowed down. It was harder to get court cases. Everything kind of slowed down, and that impacted people's kind of decision making about these things. So we believe that you should ensure the system is working to deliver. You want to, we have a bunch of strategies to increase the clearance rate, ensure crimes are actually punished with strategies that have worked in place in country and cities around the country. We also believe, from data that there are prevention strategies that have been successful. And then there are particular areas where we've seen some surges in crime and that raise some significant problems that we want to address. But at a very high level, I think thematically, we believe it's important to ensure, swift and certain punishments to hold lawbreakers accountable and also invest in strategies, policing strategies and prevention strategies that work. And what's interesting about this to me is that you have progressive mayors in places like Baltimore that have increased detectives and increased police officers and also worked on, kind of innovative crime fighting / prevention strategies like focused deterrence and have seen great results. And I think that's what, we're focused on. What would actually work to reduce crime? What are the strategies that are working? And we don't have to relive the kind of bad policy decisions of the 90s or things that had really negative effects, like just expanding sentences for everybody and not giving them a second chance. We strongly believe in second chances, but we also know we should build on what we know it works.
Is there a sort of bipartisan path for achieving this, especially sort of focusing on the swiftness and the certainty and improving clearance rates? It feels like that's something that I know Utah just passed a law and signed a law that says that can provide grants to agencies to improve their violent crime clearance rates. Is this something, and have you guys done any work on sort of taking that as the bipartisan, okay, this is something that across the political spectrum we can all agree on as a thing to do?
Yeah, so I think this is what's really interesting because at the local level, this is very bipartisan. You have moderate mayors, progressive mayors. I mean, not every progressive mayor, but a lot of progressive mayors taking on strategies that do work. I just mentioned Baltimore. And, it's interesting, Mayor Mamdani hasn't really repealed any of the strategies or like at a high level has not really repealed the strategies that he that were, having a good impact on lowering crime rates. And so I hope at the national level, we could actually have bipartisan efforts. I worry that, crime has been basically used a little, and I argue, I don't mean to be partisan here, but Republicans have kind of often used crime as a wedge to attack Democrats. And, there's been some reporting that the president and the White House plan to use crime again in the fall elections. And so, I hope we can get out of this kind of hyperpolarization we're in. But I think, as you mentioned, Utah, I mean, places like Illinois have focused on actually trying to address their clearance rate problems. And I think they are, they have to live with the consequences of crime. So I think they have a lot more skin in the game in a way. And so we see a lot of bipartisanship there. And I hope that that carries on at the national level.
You talked about sort of the Republican approach to crime and this kind of instinctual, I guess, we have to be tough on crime. We have to increase sentences, which it felt like for about a decade was going away and is kind of making its way back into the national discourse. Taking on the other side of that, is there a way for Democrats to, we saw this a lot in 2020, and then in the reaction of the last few years, it felt like, and maybe I'm wrong and you feel differently, but it felt like the responses were either ignoring when things were getting worse, which they were in the sort of that 2020 to 2022 period, or when the only response was, well, we got to get tough on crime. Is there a way for Democrats to sort of ignore that false dichotomy of either it has to be going down or our response has to be we have to be tough on crime? I'm sorry, that's a little sounds
That's a great question. And I think we are trying to offer ideas right in that space. Okay. So if someone is punished, for shooting someone and not killing them, we know from the data that people who get away with certain crimes, tend to commit more crimes. So, my view of this is I think like people are kind of in the middle on this topic. The vast majority of the public is kind of, in the middle. They think we should invest in prevention. They think it's better to prevent crime. So it's not just soft to prevent crime. It actually reduces crime when you prevent it. You just have to have strategies that do work to do that. It's good to have an evidence base for that. But also, but they also think that people should be held accountable for crime. And I think to be totally to be very honest about this, I think one of the challenges for some Democrats from 2020, 2021, 2022 was that it sounded like to a lot of people, we didn't think crime was a problem. And if you don't think crime is a problem, people are going to think you are not likely to do much about it. Okay. And one of my singular experiences from working in policymaking for 3 presidents is, this is just like how I see the world. If people really think something is a problem and it is a high priority problem for them, they will choose a bad answer over no answer. Now, I still believe people will choose a good answer over a bad answer. Sometimes that is kind of tested in the political process, but I still believe in that. But I think one of the reasons why CAP put forward this plan is because we believe it's important for everyone who believes in safety and security to offer ideas of how you can reduce crime. And as I said earlier, you don't have to go to really, kind of the failed policies of the past or this tough on crime rhetoric, which is really just about extending sentences to actually reduce crime in a way that's very effective. But Democrats should acknowledge that the broad public believes lawbreakers should be held accountable. This is not a radical statement to me. I think this shouldn't be a radical statement for people. I do think if you believe in making sure lawbreakers are accountable, when they do their time and they're done with their time, you want to encourage them to get into a pathway, a job, or be a productive citizen and not use their prior sentence as a life scarlet letter A, which limits their opportunities to do anything other than crime. So, like, I think we should just be smart about this, and people could meet in the middle. And in the localities, they kind of have met in the middle.
Is there like a phrase that we can use that's not, I hate tough on crime. I wish it was like, shot into the sun and never heard
Yeah.
from again. I feel like it used to be smart on crime was like a thing that people could say that was this, this middle ground. Is there a phrase that can replace that as the one that you sort of acknowledge crime as an issue that's important that we take care of, but not take care of by repeating the mistakes of the 90s? Is there,
Yeah. Or
what's the jingo here?
believe, like, we talk about, accountability for crime and stopping crime. Like, just we kind of think like you could do both of those, prevention and accountability. But accountability isn't, lock people away and throw away the key. And we should acknowledge that. And we acknowledge in our plans that this criminal justice system has been one that where punishments have been disproportionate for people of color. That fact that we have in the United States made going to prison a kind of lifetime sentence in a way, it's been really counterproductive. It's hurt those people individually, not giving them a second chance. But also it drives poverty. It makes us much less productive as a country if you basically take people who have ever had essentially a criminal sentence and kind of move them out of the kind of productive economy. That is also kind of stupid. So I think there's a smarter way to go forward. I'll think about a better expression. Smart on crime was a good one. A certain vice president came up with it when she was an attorney general, wrote a whole book about it. Very complicated field here. So I think you're right. It like trying to connote the idea that crime is a problem, but we don't have to engage in the failures of the past. That is what we're trying to do, and I'll work on an expression, but welcome your ideas as well.
I'll think about that as well, and maybe I'll bring it up to my kids and have them come up with
Yeah.
something. Um, so let's fast forward. Let's say it's 2028, and right now we're seeing historic drops. Let's say that those drops don't continue. We're at this really low level, but we're not seeing crime continue to fall. At some point, crime is going to stop falling. We're not going to reach zero murders, unfortunately. I don't think so. How would you advise sort of that political message to both Democrats or Republicans if crime is the declines have stopped, we're at this low level, maybe we're starting to see slight increases relative to where we were before, but how would you advise sort of politically not denying that reality of,
Yeah.
hey, it's not going down anymore, while also then not leaning into bad policies and not requiring people to take the toughest on crime approaches as possible?
I think people would have more credibility if they see a crime spike, if they deal with crime, whenever like in their basic job as governors or mayors or leaders. And I think that because, as you know, crime is declining now. It has been declining. And yet people still think crime is a pretty significant problem. And I think this is a big disconnect for people, which is crime is not like other issues. Okay. So, whether people have health care or they have energy tax credits, like more of it is a good thing, less of it is a bad thing. I think crime is a very different kind of event in people's lives. It's very shocking. Even getting mugged is very shocking. It creates a sense of greater fear and instability. So crime is really an issue. And I know I'm saying like a very basic thing, but any of it is bad. Okay. So if you're a mayor and your crime comes down, like you have your crime went up 25% and it came down 25%. It's not like you're like, okay, we
Too
just
much.
don't need the police anymore. Like everybody wants, no one wants to be victimized by crime. So your job is to always lower it. And what's really interesting about the debate today is we seem so trapped in the debates of the 90s. Because what's interesting is we have a big social experiment over the last 5 years, right? We saw a big crime spike. At the same time, the federal government sent a lot of money to states and localities. Those states and localities did all kinds of different things to drive lower crime rates. I mean, we don't know for sure any answer, but we do know that localities innovated in different ways, and they did see like really sharp declines. And there are things that a lot of localities did. They hired or retained police officers with those funds. They invested in prevention programs. They also adopted particular strategies like real-time crime centers and focused deterrence and even hotspot policing. There's a bunch of strategies that localities adopted, and we saw great reductions. So from our perspective, I would advise someone in 2028, if we're seeing a crime spike, to have ideas that and base them on what's effective and what's worked at the local level and how you can make a compelling case that Baltimore did this thing and its crime rates came down. But I also think you'll have a lot more credibility on these issues if you talk about them before you're facing the voters as a mayor or as a governor or as even a senator or a House member, because I think the truth is it's not like you can lower crime too much in most people's minds. There are trade-offs, like, you could lower, we could all live in a police state and have no crime, like, that's not what anyone wants, but there's a big area for not violating people's civil rights, having smart strategies, and lowering crime rates.
It to that point, is there a way to convince people that that crime is falling? I mean, that it's the bane of my existence is that no matter what's happening, especially in like 2023, 2024, when I felt like a lonely voice talking about the degree to which crime was falling. Is there out there in the wild, at least, is there a way to get people to believe good news on crime?
Yeah, I mean, I think this really is much more of an issue around local news coverage and kind of the orientation of the media, which is that if it bleeds, it leads. And there's a lot of interest in crimes. And I think it takes much more police chiefs and prosecutors to talk about lower crime rates than politicians. And I mean, I had a particular experience. I was president's domestic policy advisor. We saw crime come down dramatically. We religiously read all your material that was much faster. What's really great about you is that you're able to track crime rates a lot faster than the FBI. So you actually you can see what's happening much closely, much faster. And that's crucial as a policymaker because addressing trends that are 2 years old, not that helpful and helpful these days. So we saw crime rates coming down, and I think a real issue that we had was perhaps because people have kind of preconceived notions that Democrats don't take crime seriously enough. The president, went into the State of the Union and said crime is coming down, and we've done these things to help crime come down. And I think a lot of people heard that, given their sense that crime is still a problem, as we didn't get it, that crime is still a problem. And so I think when a political leader, this is just, my experience here, was trying to tell people, it's a little bit about like the economy. If people feel like the economy is bad, if you try to tell them over and over again that the economy is great, they're not going to think my lived experience is wrong. They're going to think the politician is lying. So the people who can best deliver the good news on crime, are people with credibility on crime. I think that's police chiefs. I think it's like members, like the police. It could be the prosecutors. It could be judges. Like, so people who don't have a stake in trying to convince you. But I also think, crime is not as salient an issue. People still think crime is like a big problem that's going up, but it has changed in salience to people, at least in the polling we've seen from 2022, 2023. There was like top 4 or 5 issue to one of the top 4 or 5 issues to the public. Maybe the top 6 issues. Now it's dropped to like the top 10, maybe the top 12.
Yeah.
But to me, I believe that it's really crucial for leaders to have a plan that they can communicate. And, there's no, like, again, we're not recreating the problems of the past. So we don't see the downside in actually offering ideas that can help even lower your crime rate more.
Is there a way, I feel like I ask this to every guest, but I think that it's such a critical question, which is there a way for the media to cover the planes that land, to cover the fact that, hey, robbery's down 30%. We're seeing this big decline in these crimes. It's hard to write a story that's there were no crimes last week. It's easy to write a story of there were 6 crimes last week and they were terrible. How is this something that at a very local level can be covered better?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I think localities, local press would be the best. And I do want to say, I mean, I'm happy to beat up on local media, but I think another real problem in the country is that we just have less local media than we used to have. I mean, there's just fewer there's just fewer outlets covering local news in the same way. But I do think we have all these moments where we kind of nationally look at data. There's a monthly unemployment rate. There's nothing that stops localities from looking at their sort of monthly year-over-year homicide rate, or even doing that quarterly, or in their violent crime rates, and really trying to track for their readers that, violent crime has come down. Again, any violent crime is bad. This is like a thing where it's like, it's a shocking event to anybody. We would like less of it, We like less cancer. It's like cancer can come down. You'd like to get to zero. So, but I do think you could have a lot more just check-ins, like once a month or once every quarter or once every 6 months, just where crime is, and to write I mean, like, I know it doesn't catch as many eyeballs, but writing a story about lower crime rates, would be important. And I think the thing that you to remember about this is, people don't translate it this way, but when you have lower crime rates, that means people are alive today that might not have been alive, when you had really high crime rates, right? I mean, the thing that reducing crime and reducing murders and homicides for sure is that, like, these are, again, kind of transformative events. Like, being shot is a pretty psychologically damaging and health damaging idea, even if you survive it. So when you have reduced crime, like, this is a huge improvement in people's lives and their lived experience. So it
Yeah,
should
you're
be a
looking
good story.
It should be, yeah, and you're looking at probably 5,000 fewer murder victims per year than
Yeah, but
5
there's
years ago.
5,000. I tried to the president I talked about this with President Biden. We did a event with major chiefs, like, almost 2 years ago, probably 2 years ago now. I mean, we had major chiefs from at the White House from Detroit and Miami, 2 places that have just, like, 50-year lows and homicides, and we had a bunch of from all across the country: Los Angeles, Charlotte, big and small stuff, Philadelphia. And, he talked a little bit about this, but, when you have 5,000 fewer homicides, I mean, a way to think about that is like this, for a variety of reasons, but I do think policy is important. You're having hotspot policing and more police, et cetera, as well as prevention programs. When you do those things, I mean, you have people walking around like, alive that may have been killed in some prior point. So it's a big difference. It makes a big difference in communities, and it makes a big difference in how people feel about, like, living in cities and being close to other people. I mean, these are really profound effects to lower crime rates.
There's obviously a lot going on in the world right now. Not sure if you're aware. Uh, is
It's
there a way
definitely tracking. There's a lot going on in the world today.
Um, is there a way that this issue, not just crime, but sort of criminal justice and
Mhm.
improving the system and ensuring clearance rates is a top priority and reducing crime, how can all of this stay at the forefront of policymaker attention, given, waving hands all about everything that's happening?
Yeah, in our research, I think that what was most interesting is that probably the best thing a locality can do, again, I kind of, you have a lot of wisdom on these topics, so I welcome your view, but is just speeding up the entire criminal justice system. So people are getting punishment. Like, they know what they feel like, if I'm caught, I will likely be punished quickly. It doesn't, again, you don't have to give people lots of sentences, but if they are guilty of a crime, they should be punished quickly. And in our view, given second chances when they're out, etc. But that's an interesting thing, because it's not like there's any single group responsible for that. That's often the state. Sometimes it's a locality. It's very opaque, kind of controls the wheels of the justice system. And we try to address that by, in our plan, have encouraging funding to beef up that in those institutions essentially and allow them to move a lot faster. But that's an area where I think it's just like I it's easier for a politician to a local mayor to say, I've added police or I've invested in prevention programs. And it's a little bit harder for them to communicate how investing in their local criminal justice system, having more public defenders and prosecutors, but public defenders too, helps actually ensure a better system that keeps all of us safe. I mean, it takes kind of a few paragraphs to explain that, not just a few sentences. And often one of the challenges in public policy is things that take longer to explain get adopted a little less just because people see less value in doing it. But here,
That's
it's really important to actually do the right thing to save people's lives, so
yeah.
hopefully they'll do it.
Well, I see that in my newsletter every week that the more interesting, detailed, in-depth of investigations, you get nothing, and then you're like, well, crime is down, and then those are the ones that get shared, and everyone hears that. So certainly, I know we just have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask real quick. This is something I've been asking every guest. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this, given your experience. How do you think AI is going to change sort of the approach to all of this, or the policymaker approach in the near future? And do you have any sort of suggestions on changing perceptions of AI adoption? I know this is sort of out in left field, but I'm
No,
really
no,
interested
no.
to hear your thoughts on that.
So I feel like I was very fortunate. I sat on the president's AI council. There was a AI council in the White House, and sort of had I was on it, and obviously National Security Council was on it, and various policy councils sat on it. And what's really interesting is one of the big problems in the criminal justice system, and one of the real drivers of unfairness in the criminal justice system is human bias, right? I mean, there's been lots and lots and lots of data that eyewitnesses are less reliable. They will bring in sort of unconscious bias towards racial groups that also could infect policing. A lot of cases of, police involved shootings are ones where, you're in a moment, you're just making hasty decisions. Those can also involve human bias. I mean, the truth is the jury system has a lot of human biases. So I am not actually arguing that we should replace juries with AI or other, kind of take out the human of the process. But I think if we had AI systems that were better at correcting biases instead of amplifying those biases, is a little hard because
Absolutely.
AIs are programmed by people. But a system, and like it's criminal justice, but it could be like who you're giving a mortgage to. I mean, we have lots of data that essentially Black families are charged higher interest rates with the same income and the same history because there are biases that they experience in the system. And a lot of them can be sort of unconscious. People aren't really thinking. I have this thing in my mind about what a woman versus a man, or a Latino versus a white person, or a Black person versus an Asian. I mean, there are a lot of biases in the system. So if there are ways to think about, I tried to encourage this. It was a little hard and very nascent, but if there are ways to think about how AI could fight against those biases and not entrench them, I actually think we'd have a lot more justice than we do. And you'd have like some of the areas where you see these gigantic differentials between crack cocaine, or, some of these conversations in the past are, I think, a function of just biases kind of running up against each other, and like kind of like building on top of each other in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, we definitely see that in the research into the algorithm shows that the algorithm is unbiased, but taking that a step further is biased, excuse me, not
Yeah, it's
unbiased.
biased.
But it's less biased than that human judge. I'm in New
Mhm.
Orleans, and there's research into cases in Louisiana where if LSU loses in football, judges have harsher penalties the next day in court. And so, like, how do you remove all that? Well, an algorithm that's not perfect. So I appreciate that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and like with anything, I think, we never get to nirvana, but like you always have to kind of try to get better and better. And like I definitely am open to thinking about ways that AI can be helpful. It shouldn't replace humans, particularly in life and death decisions like this. That's obviously kind of out of a murder or sci-fi movie. To have like AI replacing humans. But I think we should be genuinely honest that we over-index for human judgment being unbiased than it is. And it is a big reason for inequality in a lot of systems that humans are bringing their bias to decision making.
Absolutely. Neera, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a fascinating and fantastic conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I
Uh,
hope people will check out our CAP plan on our American Progress website.
I was just going to say, where can people find it? So CAP, American Progress website, go check it out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.